צהריים טובים.
Good afternoon.
Michal,
My name is Michal Hatuel-Radoshitzky. I'm a researcher here at the Institute.
אנחנו מתחילים.
And we would like to begin.
קהילות יהודיות חיות
Jewish
ומשגשגות.
communities are living and
העולם.
thriving across the world.
עם זאת,
However,
רוב העם היהודי
most of the Jewish
מצוי
people
כיום
is
בשני
currently
מרכזים
in
עיקריים,
two main
בישראל
hubs,
ובארצות הברית.
in Israel and the United States.
החשיבות האסטרטגית
The strategic importance of our relations and the relations between Israel and the United
זוכה
States
להכרה ולהערכה
is recognized and appreciated
גם
greatly
בקרב ההנהגה בישראל
among
וגם
Israeli
בקרב
leadership
הציבור.
as well as the Israeli
אבל
public. However,
נראה שהנושא
it seems
של היחסים
that the matter
בין
of the
מדינת
relations
ישראל
between the state of
לבין
Israel
יהדות ארצות הברית
and the US
נתון
Jewry
לפרשנויות שונות,
is very much charged,
ובדרך כלל
open to
לא
interpretation,
זוכה
and more often
למידת
than
הקשב
not
הראויה
is
בישראל.
not
בשנה
doesn't receive
החולפת,
attention.
אנחנו במכון
In the last 12 months, we
מקיימים
at the
פרויקט
INSS
מחקר
have had a
בשיתוף
research
קרן
project
משפחת
together
רודרמן,
with the Rodman Family Fund
שמנסה
that
להאיר
attempts to
מערכת
shed light
יחסים זו
on this relationship
ולהבין
and
את
to understand
תרומתה
its
של יהדות ארצות
contribution
הברית
and the
לביטחון הלאומי
contribution
של
of the
מדינת
US
ישראל.
Jewry to Israel's national security.
הקשר בין הקהילות עוצב
The
עוד לפני
nexus
קום
between the
המדינה,
communities began before the establishment of the State of Israel and certainly throughout its 70 years of
בלי להיכנס
existence.
לפרטי
And
ההיסטוריה
without going into
ובשל
history
קוצר
too
היריעה,
much
נאמר
and
רק
for lack of time,
שבעת
we will just
האחרונה
say that
מתרבים הסימנים
recently
להתרחקות בין
signs
הקהילות
of
מסיבות
distancing
שונות
between the communities for
שאת
various
חלקן ננסה
reasons
לבאר
have
במושב.
emerged, and we'll try to find
אז
out
בואו
why.
נתחיל עם שני
So let
ציונים
us
קצרים.
begin with two short videos.
Okay, go.
Hello from a wintry Boston.
שלום
We're sorry we
מבוסטון
can't be with you
הגשומה,
today in
סליחה
Israel,
שאנחנו...
but we feel like we're there in spirit with our friends on this panel. We appreciate the inclusion of the study of the American Jewish community's impact on Israel's security.
We are assured that this conversation, the finding of the research, and the panel today will impact the relationship between American Jewry and the State of Israel. We want to take this opportunity and thank our partners in INSS and the panelists for dedicating their time to this very
על
important
שהקדישו את
issue
זמנם
of
לנושא
studying the
חשוב
relationship
זה
between
של
American Jewry
חקר
and the
מערכת
State of
היחסים
Israel.
והיחסים
We
בכלל
wish
בין
you a
יהדות
wonderful
ארצות הברית
conference.
לעם בישראל. תהנו מהכנס.
אנו קוראים אל העם היהודי בכל התפוצות להתלכד סביב היישוב בעלייה ובבניין ולעמוד לימינו במערכה הגדולה על הגשמת שאיפת הדורות לגאולת ישראל.
So before we begin the discussion, let us look together at the Israeli society's position on issues that will be discussed in this panel as emerging from the poll carried out in November-December 2017 by the INSS and was presented yesterday by Ms. Tzipi Israeli. So we asked, how does the American jury contribute to Israel's national security? 38% said the impact of the American jury to support Israel is the most important thing. Advocacy and support of Israel in the international arena. And this poll was conducted before Trump's declaration about Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And I'm guessing that the percentages would have been even higher in this specific question if it had been conducted afterwards. 29% that the American jury contributes through advocacy for U.S. military support, and 23% said that their contribution is the philanthropy to Israeli institutes and initiatives. We also asked which trend characterizes the relations between the Jewish communities in Israel and in the US. Here we were surprised to find that the majority of Israeli society does not feel that there is any problem. In fact, 50% of the Israeli public did not see any change in the relations between the US jury and Israel, and some even think that they have become more intimate. Only 21% feel that some distance has been made between the communities, and when we asked those 21% what is the main reason for them growing apart, we saw that 56% referred to the fact that there is a growing gap between the different Israeli denominations, Jewish denominations, Reform, etc. And only 16% talked about the Palestinian relations. The last question we asked was, how do you perceive the relationship between Israel and the American jury? And here, perhaps we'll give some background as to why we decided to ask this question. During the research, we realized that the approach or attitude of the U.S. jury is that of two equal centers, equal in size, equal in importance. So we came to the Israeli public and we saw that 83% of the public in Israel feels that Israel is the center of the Jewish people, whereas only 17% agree with the Americans that the Jewish people have two equally important and large centers. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. So let me just introduce the speakers that have come here today to speak about this important issue of the relations between the American jury and Israel and its impact on Israel's national security. Janet?
Okay, yeah. Okay.
We on? Great.
Okay.
Okay, so let me introduce the speakers. Next to me is Dr. Einat Wilf, formerly a member of Knesset and the head of the subcommittee for the relations between Israel and the diaspora Jews. And she also headed the combat against delegitimization of Israel. She is a leader in education and foreign relations. And next to her is the Ambassador Dan Shapiro, who is a fellow, a visiting fellow at the INSS. He was previously the ambassador to Israel from the State Department in the US, and he also took part in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, as well as in the deal with Iran, and also took part in the $38 billion aid to Israel. Next to him is Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of
ומוביל
the
את כל תחומי הפעילות של
anti-BDS
ארגון זכויות
movement
אזרח מכובד
is
וותיק
a
זה.
very well
מאז נכנס
experienced
לתפקידו
human rights activist
ב-2015,
until he,
התאים ג'ונתן את
since he
הארגון
came into
שנוסד
office in 2015,
ב-1913
he adapted
לרוח
this
הזמן,
organization
תוך היצמדות
to
למשימתו
the
הכפולה,
spirit of the
להפסיק
time,
את
and it
השמצת
had
העם
a
היהודי
dual mission to
ולהבטיח
stop
צדק
the
ויחס
defamation
הוגן
against the Jewish
לכל.
people and to ensure that everyone
ולידו
gets
יושבת
equal
נעמה אור,
rights.
מנהלת בכירה
And
ויזמית
next to him
חברתית
is
שנמצאת בשלבי
Naama
הקמה
Or,
של
who
מיזם לאומי
is
של תגלית הפוכה
currently doing
לחיזוק הזהות
the
היהודית
opposite
של
to
ישראלים
birthright,
וחיבורם
strengthening
ליהדות התפוצות.
Israelis' identity
נעמה חזרה
and
לאחרונה
connecting
משהות של
them
5 שנים
to
בבוסטון,
the
שם הקימה
US
וניהלה
Jews.
סניף של ארגון
She just
IAC,
came back from
Israeli
5
American
years
Council,
in
במטרה
Boston,
לחזק
where
את הזהות
she
היהודית
did the
והישראלית של
IAC, the
ישראלים
Israel
שחיים
American
בבוסטון.
Council. She set it up, and she strengthened
אתחיל
the
בבקשה
identity
עם
of Israelis
ג'ונתן
living in
ועם
Boston.
נעמה.
So we'll begin with Jonathan
ראינו
and
פה את
Naama.
הנתונים
We
על
saw
הציבור
the
בארץ,
findings about
ומה
what
הם
the Israeli
חושבים
public
בנושא
thinks
הקשר בין
about the
הקהילות.
relations between
ואני רוצה לשאול
Israel
אתכם, האם
and
אתם
the
מסכימים
American
עם רוב
Jews.
הציבור
And
בארץ
we want
שבעצם
to
לא
ask
מרגיש
you, do
שיש
you
בעיה?
agree with the
ואם יש
majority of
בעיה,
Israeli
אז מה המקור
citizens
שלה?
who think that there
אם
is no
תוכלו
problem, or
לאפיין
if there is a problem, what
נתחיל
is
עם
the
נעמה.
source of it?
Thank you
start
very
with
much.
Naama.
אז שלום לכולם, תודה רבה שהזמנתם אותי כאן להשתתף
Thank you
בכנס
very
החשוב.
much. Thank you for inviting me to speak in this conference and this distinguished group of
אני
people.
חושבת שהנתונים
I
שהראית,
think that the findings
מתחילה
you
הבעיה.
showed, that's where the problem actually
כשמסתכלים על
starts,
הנתונים,
because when you look at these
ואחרי
findings,
שבאמת חזרתי
and
ממש
having
לאחרונה
recently
מ5
returned
שנים
from
בבוסטון
5 years
כמנהלת
in
של הקהילה
Boston
הישראלית
as the
בתפוצות,
head of the
ונגיד את זה
Israeli
בהמשך,
community in the
שחי ומחבר
diaspora
את
who
הקהילה
lives and
היהודית,
connects to the Jewish community,
יש פער שהולך
there is a
וגדל.
huge and
הקהילה
growing
היהודית,
gap.
היום
The Jewish
מסתכלת, ויש
community
בלבול
is
מאוד
now
גדול.
looking, and there is a
מה
big
תפקידה, מה
confusion there.
תפקידנו, איך
What
אנחנו
is its
יכולים
role?
לעבוד
What is
ביחד.
our role? How can we work together?
כמו שראינו כאן
And as
בסרטון,
we saw in the
אנחנו
video,
קמנו, המטרה הייתה להקים את מדינת
the
היהודים.
idea was to set
וזה
up a
יהודי
Jewish
התפוצות,
state,
ראו בזה
a
כחלום,
Jewish
כשליחות.
homeland. It was a
ואנחנו היום
dream, it
מדינה
was a
כל-
mission,
חזקה,
and we
עם
now have a
כלכלה
strong
חזקה.
economy, a strong
כאן
country.
מה תפקידם כיום?
And now we're
ואנחנו
wondering
כישראלים
what
אומרים,
is our
אוקיי,
role
70
now. And
שנה
as
הקמנו
Israelis, we're
מדינה,
saying, okay,
והאם
it's
היום
been
אנחנו
70
רוצים
years,
להבין
we
מה
have a
המשמעות
state
שלנו
now. Now
כמדינת
what
ישראל, אם
is
אנחנו באמת
our
מדינת הלאום של העם היהודי.
purpose as a Jewish country? Are we
וצריך
really the
לעבור
homeland of all the
מאיזושהי
Jews?
פאזה של
Do we
בניית
need to
מדינה
move from
לבניית קהילות?
building a state to building
מעבר לזה, יש כאן בעיה
communities?
זהותית
And
לא
aside
פשוטה.
from that, there
והאם
is an
הישראלים
identity
באמת רואים את עצמם
problem.
כיהודים?
Do
האם
Israelis
אנחנו
really see
מבינים
themselves
שאנחנו
as
חלק
Jews? Do we
מעם
understand
יהודי?
that we are part of the
מה
Jewish
זה אומר
people?
להיות
What does it
יהודי
mean
ישראלי?
to be an
ורואים
Israeli
את זה
Jew?
מאוד מאוד חזק
And we
בישראלים
see it
שמגיעים
very
לגור
prominently
בתפוצות.
in Israelis living outside of
וזה
Israel.
נופל מאוד חזק
And
על עניין
it
הבורות.
also
הבורות
is a
המאוד
matter
גדולה
of
שאנחנו גדלים
ignorance,
כאן.
huge ignorance we are
ואנחנו
raised with
ראינו,
here in
רובם לא
Israel.
מרגישים- רובנו לא
Most
מרגישים
of us
שיש בעיה
don't even
ביחסים, אבל
realize
זה
there
לאו
is a
דווקא
problem
אין
in the
בעיה,
relations,
זה
not
בגלל
because there is no
שלא
problem,
מבינים
but
בכלל
because we
את
don't
המשמעות
even
של להיות
understand
חלק
the
ואזרח
significance
מעם
and
יהודי,
meaning
ולא
of
מבינים
being
מה
part of the
אנחנו
Jewish
יכולים
people
לקבל
and
תועלת
what
מאחד
we
מהשני.
can gain from one
צריך לשים
another.
לב שאין פה שתי קהילות.
And we must
אנחנו
see
לא
that it's
קהילה,
not
אנחנו
two
מדינה.
communities. We're not a community,
ואם
we're a
נחזור
state.
לנאום ארבעת
And if we
השבטים,
go
יש לנו
back
מדינה
to the
מורכבת
four
משבטים
tribe
שונים, ואנחנו
speech
בטח
of
לא
the
כולם
president
מסתכלים על
of
יהדות
Israel,
התפוצות
then
באותה דרך.
we don't see
אבל
things
גם
the
הם לא
same
קהילה
way.
אחת.
We don't see
גם יהדות
the
התפוצות
Jews
מורכבת
of the
בהרבה מאוד
diaspora in the
קבוצות
same way, and
וקהילות,
they're
שכל
not
אחד יש לו
one
הסתכלות
group
אחרת
either. They each have their own
ורצונות אחרים,
communities, they
אבל
each
מה
have their
שכן,
own desires
הם
and needs.
בוחרים כל יום
However,
לקום
they
בבוקר
choose each and
ולהיות
every
יהודים.
day to be
לנו זה ברור
Jews.
מאליו.
To us,
וזה
it's
מה שמנסים
obvious.
להנחיל
And
לילדים
that's what
שלהם,
we're
איך
trying,
לקום
what
כל
they're
בוקר,
trying to
איך
instill
להסתכל,
in their
לדבר,
children, how
לייצר
to
שיח
wake up each
בישראל,
morning, how to
איך
create a
לשמר
discourse
את
on
הדור
Israel,
הבא.
how
אני
to
חושבת שיש כאן
preserve
משהו
the
מאוד מאוד
identity of the
משמעותי,
future
ללמוד
generation. And I
אחד
think that is
מהשני
something that we
בעניין.
can certainly learn
וגם
from
צריך
them.
לזכור שרוב
And we
יהודי
must
ארצות
also
הברית
remember
יהודים
that most of the
ליברליים,
American Jews are liberals,
וגם להם צריך לשים את זה על השולחן,
and we
שלא
have to
כל
put
כך
it on the
פשוט
table. It's not
לממשלה
easy for
ימנית,
them with
וזה
such a
פער
right-wing
שגם
government here in Israel, and that is
גורם
also a
בכלל
gap
לפער.
that creates
אני רק רוצה
tension.
להדגיש שבעיניי
I'd like to
יש
reiterate
כאן
that
משהו
as
מאוד
I
משמעותי
see it,
דווקא
there's
לחשוב
something
איך אנחנו
very
מייצרים
significant
חיבור.
about
תמיד
how
אפשר
we
לחשוב
can
איך מייצרים
create a
ניתוק.
connection. We
המשמעות
can
איך
always
מייצרים
think
חיבור,
about how we can create a disconnection
מי
or a
מכם שמכיר
detachment.
את
But if
אברהם
anyone
הינפלד
knows Avram
והמודל
Himfeld
שלו
and his
על מי
model
אנחנו כעם יהודי
of
על
who we
5,000
are as a Jewish people, there are 5 legs, so to speak, 5 foundations that connect us, and that is the shared memory, that we are all one big family, that we have all been given the same Bible on the same Mount Sinai. We may interpret it differently, and perhaps as individuals and groups we don't look at that book the same way, but we've all been given it. And if we take these things, we can understand the connection as a Jewish people no matter where where you're living, but we need to deepen our knowledge here in Israel so that we feel like we're a part and that we raise generations who feel like they're a part of a larger Jewish nation. And I'm not talking about Judaism as a religion so much, but as a sense of belonging, because as I feel, or as I see it, you cannot be a Jew without having Judaism inside you. It's like having a body without a head. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for the question. I think I would build upon what my colleague said, that there absolutely is a growing distance between the American Jewish and the Israeli populations. And there's a deep irony to this sort of alienation and distance that seems to be taking place, because in many ways, you know, several of the accelerations that Tom Friedman talked about on Monday night, like globalization and technology, in many ways are bringing actually American Jews and Israeli Jews closer together than ever before. So you have technology. Just Facebook alone has opened up a line of communication that was never there before. You have programs like Taglit and academic exchanges. You have Tamid, and then you have Shluchim coming to American campuses in large numbers. You have all the study abroad programs, and you have the summer camps, and you have the gap years, and you have Israel studies popping up at universities all over the US, and Israel academics on loan, and the whole Technion, Cornell thing building in New York. And you have companies like Waze and WeWork and Get, and you have Gal Gadot and Fauda, and all these things that really one would think are a renaissance. But if you thought that familiarity would engender more unity, you're wrong. And American politics are polarized in ways they've never been before, and American Jews literally are the fulcrum of that, I think, in many ways. You know, President Obama, who I formerly worked for, who my friend Dan formerly worked for, I think it's safe to say he made a series of what I might characterize as missteps on Middle East policy that I don't want to rehash, but they spawned anger among certain elements of the American Jewish community, particularly on the Republican side of the ledger. And I think it's safe to say that this president has made a series of policy missteps on the domestic side that I also don't want to rehash, but that have engendered a great deal of negative reaction from the Democratic side of the ledger. And you know, as Nama said, or she alluded to, literally, only 22% of American Jews voted for this president, less than a quarter. So you start off from the point that most American Jews are not on the same page with him on a range of different issues. But he's embraced Israel in ways that are quite remarkable, but he's also really exacerbated that cleavage, I think. And you see this division actually growing a great deal. On one side, you have a surge of activists on the left, who they're almost like, as Trump embraces, there's a Newtonian response. And there's an equal and opposite reaction. And his strong embrace, I think, has allowed a number of folks on the left to really, people who are committed to delegitimization, to try to mainstream their views and plant themselves into the center of progressive discourse in the United States. And it's really quite damaging. And it's worth noting that some of the fastest growing Jewish groups, if not now, Jewish Voices for Peace. These are youth-driven organizations that are really quite committed to an agenda that I think everyone in this room would find extremely uncomfortable. And yet these are the vanguard, prompted in part by the political dynamic in the country today. And I should say that, you know, Israel has always been a tough issue. We have had AIPAC and J Street for almost 10 years. But what's now happened is within the American Jewish community, and again, I think forces here are prompting it, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has become a debated issue. That's a pretty remarkable thing. You have folks on the right who say to me, just ignore Charlottesville, and those neo-Nazis are not really a big deal. You need to focus on anti-Semitism from the left, taking over our campuses. That's the problem. And then I have folks on the left say to me, ignore Linda Sarsour. Ignore that movement. What you really need to focus on is the anti-Semitism of the right. That's the real problem. So I think this is quite extraordinary, and dynamics here in this country, I think, are playing into that. And what I mean by that specifically is, you know, again, the vast majority of American Jews are frustrated and confused and anxious about the lack of any even interest in the two-state solution, which has really been such a core part of our dialogue for decades. And I think American Jews, 80% of whom are Reform or conservative, are confused and upset about the Kotel situation, confused and upset about the conversion bill. And they don't see a clear path forward. And that's very confusing. And I also think, again, in light of what's happening in our country, they are confused and upset about the perceptions of a changing democratic atmosphere in this country. And again, whether you agree or disagree is not my point. The optics of trying to pressure the independent media, the optics of trying to pressure an independent judiciary don't play very well. Last point I'll just make is I think it could get worse. And something that I've talked to a few people about over the last 24 hours is the situation with the African refugees. Now, I'm going to say this, and some people might not like to hear it, because I know there's a strong feeling among the Israeli body politic. But if you think things are not good today between American Jews, most of whom are progressive, and Israeli Jews, when you start physically deporting African refugees who seem like the dreamers in the US, young people who by dint of their parents' decisions have grown up in this country, who speak fluent Hebrew, when you start physically picking them up and sending them over the border back to South Sudan and Rwanda, all the while you don't do the same to Ukrainians and Eastern Europeans who overstay their visas, this is not going to end well.
Thank you, Jonathan.
My final point, and this will be my punctuation mark. I think Israel has the most unique, extraordinary asset in its hands, which is the support of the diaspora and American Jewry. This is a natural resource that is more precious and more unique. It's like vibranium that you can only mine in Wakanda. And it has more value than Bitcoin or Ethereum. But it is a natural resource that you will squander, and that you will suboptimize, and that won't always be there if you don't manage it well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you.
The next question will be to Dan and Einat. We'll start with Einat.
And the question relates to the last slide regarding the perception of Israelis of Israel as the center of the Jewish people, and we understood that a lot of American Jewry feels that they are not in the diaspora and that their identity doesn't necessarily go through the state of Israel. And my question to both of you, we'll start with Einat, is what is the relationship that exists today between these two centers / center periphery, how you look at it?
אוקיי, אז אני רואה פתרון די פשוט שמחבר את שני הדברים האלה. שבקצרה בעצם
briefly connects the idea of equal communities who are equal in shaping what is the center of the Jewish people. And the way in which I moved in this direction is a story I like to tell. At the age of 16, I was part of a delegation of the Foreign Ministry. They still have these delegations. They send young people in pairs all over the world to tell other young people throughout the world that Israel is a normal country of teenagers who like music. And we mostly spoke with non-Jews, but occasionally we met with Jews too. And at one of these meetings, after we finished speaking, the questions began, and one of those young people said, okay, we heard what you have to say, so what is the most important thing that we can do for the state of Israel? I was 16 years old, a product of the general education system in Israel. There's one answer to that question, and it is, of course, make Aliyah, come to Israel. silence in the room. That young man, the courageous young man, said, "What is the second most important thing we can do for the state of Israel?" So for me, that began a journey where I suddenly encountered a community which for me were the most self-evident truths, that the best way to be a Jew is to come, make Aliyah to Israel, that life in diaspora, even if it lasts 1,000 years, are ultimately temporary and will end in a terrible catastrophe. All the things that appear in all the texts for children in Israel that I read in the classic general education in Israel, I suddenly met a community for whom these were not basic assumptions, and it challenged me. At that time, my life also began to change. Israel opened up to the world, globalization. I went to study abroad. I came home, and suddenly all the concepts appeared foreign to me. Was I, for those years that I lived in the United States, a Yoredet, and suddenly I'd made Aliyah? All these concepts didn't seem logical to define the relationships between us. And as a result, I concluded that we needed a different type of relationship. And I defined it as if the old contract, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say so, the old contract between Israel and the diaspora said more or less the following: we, the state of Israel, come to you. If you want to be good Jews, you have two options. One, come to Israel. If you didn't make Aliyah, give money, a lot, and feel really guilty that you didn't come on Aliyah. That's the classic arrangement. And I maintain that we're living in a different world where we need to build a kind of message that goes from Israel to the diaspora and says, we want Israel to be the first or second home of every Jew in the world. We still leave the option that it be your first home, the first on your priority. But we want to open before you the possibility that Israel be your second home. And a second home doesn't mean to buy real estate in Jerusalem. It means that Israel becomes something meaningful in your lives, all your life, whether it is in visiting it, learning the language professionally, but Israel is indeed something very meaningful in your lives, and that is what I would like to see in terms of the relationship. One of the means to do so is the argument. One of the lectures I like to give is to non-Jewish delegations that visit Israel, and the lecture is, what is a Jewish state? And I go through Jewish history with them, pre-modern and modern history, modernity and Judaism, and in the end I tell them, and now I'll give you a definition for a Jewish state, and you won't need any other definition afterwards. A Jewish state is the only state in the world in which we argue over what a Jewish state is. And so what I'm telling you is that the essence of the state of Israel and the Jewish Congress from day one and the Zionist movement is the constant argument over the question how to interpret what it is to be a Jewish state. And because Judaism doesn't have a pope and doesn't have a church, doesn't have anyone who determines its doctrine, the only way Jews decide how to interpret what Judaism is by arguing. And around the subject of the people from Africa that are here, what is fascinating, and this is also the message towards American Jewry and world Jewry on this subject, is that the argument held in the state of Israel is being held over exactly what a Jewish state needs to do on that subject. What is the right thing to do in terms of Jewish state? And because there is no single interpretation of what that is, we find people on both sides of the argument with two completely different policy recommendations, and they say, both say, we're doing it in the name of Israel being a Jewish state. And so as far as I see it, the way to take the two communities equal in size, but Israel is certainly the sovereign center of the Jewish people. We have no other state. We're the only state of the Jewish people. In my opinion, the message is to come to the people of the world and say to them, come be part of the argument. Come yell with us, fight with us. Don't be silent. We don't want you to be silent. Come be part of the argument. The argument is what makes Israel a better state, a better Jewish state. And the more you are part of the argument, we will build a better Jewish people and a better state of Israel.
Dan?
I'll speak in English if that's all right.
I'll be more accurate. Just from an analytical point of view, I think it is possible to overstate the sense of crisis, the sense of rift or drift between the two communities. Many of the trends that Nama and Jonathan spoke about are true, and you see them and hear them on campuses and elsewhere. And it is also true, and shouldn't be dismissed, that there remains a strong base of support on all the traditional areas or the traditional pillars of the relationship between the two communities. A sense of common history, a sense of common destiny, and a commitment to one another. And I don't think we should overstate it or be running to jump off cliffs because of the concerns that are real but can also be managed. Nevertheless, I think we also should acknowledge that to some degree we are dealing with two societies that are evolving, and they're evolving in perhaps opposite directions, or certainly not the same direction. The United States and the Jewish community within the United States is becoming more multicultural, more secular, perhaps more liberal even in the era of Trump, which may be an aberration from the trend line. The Israeli society tends to become more religious and more conservative over time. And so there is and that's because of demographic changes and birth rates in certain populations. And it's not something to be resisted, it's something to be understood, and that there may be some sort of natural tension there. So we all have an obligation on both sides to, as leaders of our communities and other members of our communities, work hard to bridge those gaps. And we may have to work harder than we have in the past. And I do believe there are obligations strongly on both sides. I would never want, as an American Jewish leader, or if that's what I am, or the representative of the American Jewish community, to suggest to an Israeli audience that there are not very strong obligations on the American Jewish leadership and our own community. Chiefly in education, chiefly in ensuring that our young members of our community do understand the history, do understand the importance, strategic, moral, religious, of Israel's existence and its security, and our obligations to not only get to know it and engage with it and advocate for it and learn the Hebrew that you need to really be a participant in a serious dialogue with Israeli society, and then to expand the opportunities that exist for engagement with Israelis in all of their diversity across the society. And we also have to acknowledge that Israelis live here. They face the dilemmas up front. They send their children to the military. They vote for Israeli leaders. And naturally, they will have more influence on decisions taken by the Israeli government than the American Jewish community can ever hope to have or expect to have. So we need to understand that there are those limits. And even if it's a cliche, if you want to have that kind of influence, probably you should have to make aliyah to do so. On the other side, there are also obligations, and this is very important as well. Maintaining that notion, which we struggle with because of the narrative of the State of Israel as the center of Jewish life, which is understandable if you live here, but that this is one people, that there are obligations in both directions. And therefore to be respectful of the concerns felt by other members of this bigger people, particularly when it comes to the most sensitive areas of their own self-identification, their own Jewish identity. And we've had some very rough moments in the last year or two with the decision of the Kotel Agreement, the decision to cancel the Kotel Agreement, which really touched reform and conservative Jews in the most sensitive parts of their Jewish identity. This Jewish state that I feel a connection to and want my children to now delegitimizes my form of Jewish practice. That's obviously very, very worrying. As much as we have done well and need to do more to expand the opportunities for American Jews to engage with Israeli society, for everything from Taglit across the board, all the ones Jonathan mentioned, we should be turbocharging the similar kind of effort for Israelis to get to know American Jews in all of their diversity. and where they live. Obviously, the Ruderman Foundation that sponsors our research has a number of other initiatives with members of Knesset and journalists and at the University of Haifa to build out that knowledge base in Israel, but that requires a significant additional effort. And then when we get to the issues that are usually debated between Israelis and American Jews, Israelis need to be very careful about avoiding involvement in partisan politics in the United States. It's always been better for Israel to be seen as a source of bipartisan consensus, both within the Jewish community and more broadly. And I believe it still is, but there have been decisions made in recent years, and in a very hyper-partisan environment in the United States, it's very tempting, perhaps, for Israelis to get Israeli leaders to get sucked into that. Finally, I would say in deepening the understanding of the American Jewish community and its diversity, and in showing respect for it in all of its different manifestations, there is an attitude that has currency at high levels in the Israeli government that 2/3 of American Jewry you can essentially write off. That Reform and conservative Jews are all going to assimilate, they're all going to, their children will not be Jewish or their grandchildren will not be Jewish, and these are people who we really no longer have to have a connection to. We as Israel will build out a base of support among Orthodox Jews and among evangelical Christians, but that other two-thirds of the American Jewish community can essentially be written off. This is a strategic mistake because it can have serious damage to that very strong pillar of support to the bilateral relationship, from which Israel benefits a great deal, and it's a moral mistake because it does really call into question that notion that this is one people and that Israel is the state of that Jewish people.
Thank you, Dan.
Let me have another round with one question to each of you, and please be...
As Jonathan, I'll address the first question to you. So ADL persistently struggles against anti-Semitism and white supremacism, and I believe in 2017 you issued reports that there's an uptick in anti-Semitic events in the US. We all remember the Charlottesville events, at the end of which President Trump referred to violence from both sides, and let's say the faint to non-existent response from the government of Israel. I want to ask, what does the Jewish community in the United States expect of Israel in such circumstances?
So it's a good question. So I think, first of all, indeed, just to build upon, as you framed it, there has been a rise of not necessarily anti-Semitic attitudes, but absolutely anti-Semitic incidences. In the first 3 quarters of this year, we saw a 67% increase in acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence directed at Jewish individuals and institutions. We saw nearly 100% increase in anti-Semitic bullying incidents against Jewish children in K-12 schools. We saw an almost 60% increase in anti-Semitic acts of harassment and vandalism on college campuses. So this is very real, and it is key to remember that this comes from the left and the right. But we need to push back on those people who would try to politicize the data, who would try to make it a partisan issue. It is not partisan when you have to take your young school children, preschool kids, out of the JCC because there's a bomb threat. And there's nothing political when you have to take your elderly parents out of the JCC because, there was a threat. And again, it's coming from both sides, but I'll just note that earlier this month, a young Jewish college freshman named Blaise Bernstein was stabbed to death by a young man with white supremacist ties in Los Angeles. This kid was from the University of Pennsylvania. He could be one of my children. He could be one of your cousins. And it's ironic that I opened the paper today to read about the stabbing in Paris, because I think Blaise Bernstein dying at the hands of white supremacists in the United States is like Ilan Halimi dying at the hands of Islamic fundamentalists in France some maybe 10, 12 years ago. So there are awful parallels here. Now, I think whether you're a leader in elected office or you have command some other public platform, it's important to call this stuff out simply based on the facts. And again, not allow the politics to cloud the conversation. And you can't give people a pass. And let me say this. You can't give people a pass and say, you know what? I don't care what they say about Jews because they're good on the Jewish state. And by the way, you can't get away with, I don't care what they say about the Jewish state because they're good on Jewish issues. No. Anti-Semitism is unacceptable no matter where it comes from. Period. End of story. And so I do think that when we saw what happened around Charlottesville, and I actually should say, you know, I've worked in 2 White Houses. My friend Dan has worked in a White House. Politics is not easy. You're constantly making trade-offs, right? There are no friends in politics. There's only shared interests. But there need to be core principles. And core principles needs to ride under the politics and keep you focused. So to that I would say, yeah, you know, look, we might have liked a swifter response in light of what happened in Charlottesville from the government here. But I was glad they came out and said what they did when they did. Just like I'm very glad this past weekend, by the way the government came out against this ridiculous law, Polish law, that will arrest me for talking about the Poles who murdered some of my ancestors, and I'm sure some of the ancestors of people in this room. I'm sure I'll get a démarche from the Polish embassy when I go back to New York. So that was good they called that out. As we look ahead, I think we would hope that whoever the elected government here in Israel, you take these issues of anti-Semitism in the US as seriously as you take anti-Semitism when it's spoken in the UN General Assembly or in any other institution. Call it out, call it for what it is, period.
Thank you. Dan.
Done.
אני רוצה לשאול אותך.
I'd like to ask you, as a senior diplomat, as a Jew, how do you see the complexity of the relationship between the two communities, not in those issues that you and Jonathan just spoke about it regarding pluralism, religion, but the strategic side, that there's a difference between the leaders of the state regarding the deal with Iran or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, how the difference between the leader in the United States and the one in Israel has an impact on the relationship between the communities.
This is an example of the Iran deal, particularly as an example of a situation that Israel has any time, every right, and the Israeli Prime Minister in particular has every right, and no one would expect anything else, to state when he feels there's a security threat to Israel, to articulate the risk as he sees it, to advocate for the policy that he thinks is the correct policy. That would be what any reasonable person would expect of an Israeli prime minister. And at the same time, it's a critically important thing to demonstrate, to not put natural allies and people who think of themselves as friends of Israel, and particularly in the Jewish community, in the position of being essentially accused of not caring about Israel's security if they analyze the issue differently, or if they are supportive of a different policy. And what I think we found throughout the year 2015, and it was a very difficult year in the relationship between our countries, but also between these two communities, was many American Jews feeling put in that position. Choose between your support and love and care and worry about Israel and its security and the President of the United States, who you support, and the policy that he has articulated as in the best interest of the United States and Israel. And that this difference of analysis should not be reduced to a lack of care and concern. Now, we face a somewhat different situation, of course, with the current administration, and this is a different challenge for an Israeli government. Again, no reasonable person would expect any foreign government, Israeli government included, not to seek to advance its interests by having the closest possible relationship with the President of the United States. He's the President of the United States, after all. And so any reasonable person would expect meetings and phone calls and dialogue and as much effort to coordinate the policy as possible. And yet, we are in an unprecedented period in terms of the polarization that this president is a party to, Whether or not he's entirely at fault, I don't know, but that's the atmosphere we're involved in. And so it should be possible to embrace that relationship, seek to get all the strategic benefit that derives from that close relationship, and still find ways of demonstrating sensitivity to the vulnerabilities of other populations and other constituencies that Israel cares about, that do care about Israel, and that may be back in power one day. Of course, the pendulum, just on very practical terms, the pendulum of American politics swings in both directions. And so this is a time for Israel not only to ensure that it has that close working relationship with the President of the United States, but also to ensure that those who are the President's opponents, those who feel the President has not been sufficiently outspoken on anti-Semitism from the alt-right, those who think the President may not be as sincere as I hope he is and seem to be for a number of months about pursuing what he calls the ultimate deal, which is essentially a two-state solution, are also do not conclude that Israel is disregarding their concerns, their vulnerabilities. They will have their turn, and it would be far better for Israel, again, strategically and morally, to not have alienated them or burned those bridges in the intervening years.
Thank you, Dan. Einat.
We said in the beginning, when I introduced you, in your past you were in the Knesset as a chair of the subcommittee to the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. Today you work with in the subject of Jewish people from the outside. So the question is, what you see from here, don't you see from there? Is that correct? Or what about this subject is not flaming and there's no strategic outlook in this subject of the Jews of the United States, or maybe there is? This subject was always subject for the elite, and it hasn't changed. Even in the Knesset, at any given moment, and it's the same just now, between 10 or 15 MKs will see this as an interest, they'll invest time, they'll travel, they'll think that it's very important, even they don't have a political gain immediately. But it's always those groups that saw in this subject something important for the future of the State of Israel. Where are we heading, and what is the meaning of it being the state of the Jewish people? The only thing is that at least in the Knesset, what I could do was to focus on the sovereignty issue. I must say that there are not too many political expressions that sound in Hebrew better than in English, but there is one, and I call it from rabbinate to sovereignty, which in Hebrew is rabbanut to ribonut. We are now in transit from rabbinate to ribonut, to sovereignty, and the entire significance of Zionism is to go from mechanisms that kept a people, that the fate was in the hands of others, to a situation of a people whose fate is in its own hands. In that respect, Zionism was designated to create a revolution in Jewish life. And the message that we have to convey to Jews in the world is that Zionism is the revolution in Jewish life. I have a colleague who wrote a wonderful article. He wrote, Jews in the United States are Protestants and the Jews in Israel are Catholic. What he wanted to say was that the Jews in the United States are part of the tradition where religion is the engine, whereas the Judaism in Israel is part of the tradition of the French Revolution, where throwing religion away is the engine for advancement. And that, of course, explains the whole issue of the Kotel. Because I was once at a lecture in a Reform synagogue in New York, and I, of course, said I was a feminist. And they said, look, how is it that you as a feminist don't you recruit yourself for the women of the Kotel? And I said to them, look, I'm a feminist, but in Israel it goes with other things. I'm also atheist. And therefore, for me, this entire thought that the Kotel is a synagogue, the wall, everything that said that God is in the Kotel, or you should go there in order to speak to God, I cannot explain to you to what extent this thought is alien to me. And the whole struggle, whether to enable people to pray in this way or another, in the Kotel, as a feminist in Israel, it's like in the bottom of the list. And therefore, by the way, it's interesting because the moment they did not allow secular journalists, the moment that they did not allow secular journalists to do their job, to cover the visit of Pence, then I got upset. How do you speak to God? I'm not interested in, but to not allow a woman to do her job on behalf of ideas from the 11th century? Now I'm angry. And the Jewry of the United States, if they really want to be part and parcel of the discussion and to have an impact and to understand the component of sovereignty, it has to decide who is the ally in Israel. Their allies in Israel are not going to be Reformed Jews. They're for such, but they have no mandate in the Knesset. They have two groups. One, those who care about religion. If the Jews in the United States want people who care about religion in order to make changes in Israel, then we're talking about people who are Orthodox. And the Reform interpretation and conservative is something alien to them. If they want people with liberal values, feminists, secular people who think about pluralism and equality, these will be people who drive on Shabbat and eat pork. I'm exaggerating. Now make a decision. Who are you going to work with? You cannot work in Israel with people who look like you. And if you want to generate a change, that the real Zionist change is to transfer from Rabbanut to Ribonot, from rabbinate to the sovereignty, and nobody is interested in the Knesset. I tell you immediately, nobody cares about it. The message is, how do we throw the rabbinate to all corners of the world? And to throw the rabbinate is not through discussions and interpretation on what is real Judaism. You have to understand that at the end of the day, the rabbinate is a monopoly that was given to a certain group by the State of Israel. If you want to understand the rabbinate, it's like the electric company and the airport industry, then the conservative and the Reform. So I'm saying, if the Jews in the United States really want to change something, stop talking about what is Judaism. Take consultants from companies who are experts of how to privatize the postal services or the electric company, in order that the State of Israel, in fact, will complete the Zionist revolution from passing from rabbinate to Ribonot, sovereignty.
Nama, we'd like to hear recommendations for policy, but I need to first ask the question, the very special community of Israelis living in the United States, to what extent can that community serve as a bridge between the American community in the U.S. and the Israeli community in Israel? I have so much to say, and I don't think there's going to be time for everything I want to say. I indeed came back after having established in Boston the organization of IAC to build a community of Israelis in the diaspora. Many people in the state, people say that I'm anti-Zionist, which is the last thing you could say about me, and that the organization is an anti-organization. That's exactly the misunderstanding of what Israelis in the diaspora can do and what their role will be. We were talking about somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million Israelis, former Israelis living in the United States. The number doesn't matter. We're talking about first, second, and third generation. And the question people ask if there is such a thing as a third generation Israeli living in the United States, but most are secular Israelis who came without any Jewish identity or even a lot of alienation, and they come and they're very lonely people in the big United States. They're not connected to a Jewish community. They don't understand the meaning of a Jewish community. They think that they've come for a year or 2 or 3 and they end up ending 15, 20, and I'm not being judgmental, it's a fact. The question is, what do you do? And our goal was to build a community, or rather we wanted to connect to the Jewish community, but we understood we couldn't connect individuals to the community. The Jewish community is well established, orderly, certainly in Boston, and a magnificent community. But the individuals couldn't connect, wouldn't connect, and there's no reason they would suddenly do so. So we understood that we first had to build a community of Israelis who understand the meaning of a first generation of immigrants who are raising a second generation of Israelis living outside Israel. What does this complicated, nuanced identity mean? Israeli, Jewish, American, what are we, who are we? What does it mean to be connected or not connected to the Jewish community? I think that one of the most challenging things was to convey who we are to the Jewish community in America. If you're Israelis, go back to Israel. But if you keep coming to Israel, but they keep wanting to come to Israel to get to know Israelis. But here we are, we're your neighbors, we live on the same street. Let's do things together. We can bring you authentic Israeliness and love, unconditional love for Israel. And it's difficult for you to always get that culturally and so on. And based on a very long, difficult but very right discourse, we understood we had a lot in common and that we had to learn and mostly come from a place of reciprocity, that everyone could take something meaningful from that relationship. They could take something of Israeliness. We could gain an understanding of what it means to be part of a strong Jewish community. And as for your question, definitely there is a connection, and Israeli Americans can serve as that bridge, that asset that can connect diaspora Jews to Israel. When I established the chapter 3.5 years ago, we went out to the community, said, who wants to be part of this community and be involved in it? And in that process, a number of questions came up of what's important and what's missing. And one of the things that was missing is that we don't know how to talk Israel. We talk Israel only from here, but not from here. We don't know how to talk Israel for people who live there and don't understand us. And then a young man came to Boston. He's here in the audience. His name is Avner Golov, and he works in the hosting organization Einat. He came to do a fellowship in Boston, and he said, I want to create an initiative, create a process where we train Israelis to talk Israel. And we started that process, and we understood that it was very interesting to the American community because they don't know how to talk Israel. Israel was very interesting to them to see how we talk Israel. 2 years later, the IAC and the IDC had a collaboration to bring the communications room from the IDC to Herzliya to talk differently about Israel on social media. And when they came to me to Boston to the pilot, I said, we can't do something like this without getting the Federation involved. How can we get the Jewish Federation together with the Jewish community in the diaspora to talk about Israel differently? And today, a year and a half later, the model has already moved on to other places in the US, but today there is a Jewish community which has united the AJC and the ADL and Camera and all the organizations that deal with pro-Israeli talk on a single platform, so we can bring a different voice that many people want to hear. And so I'd like to say that within this whole issue of what more can be done, even we the Israelis who come back here, and I'm very proud that I came back to my country because this is my home, but I don't judge those who change, but I came back different to Israel, and there's a lot that can be done in Israeli society to understand what the Jews, what diaspora Jewry is, and who we are as a people. That's what I'm involved in, how to do an opposite birthright, to bring all those people who are bringing more and more people to get to know who we are as a people, how we can pool all the partners who care, and to create the effect that will bring in more and more people. We're involved in a process with the government and with funding organizations to create a national initiative. It's not religious, it's Jewish, and to be part of a people and to have an impact on Israeli society and on Jewish society, to see where we're going to be in 10 years' time, and I invite you to join us.
Unfortunately, we have no more time for another round. As expected, we only just scratched the surface, so the tip of the iceberg of this issue. And I'd like to thank you very much to the members of the panel who have come from afar and from nearby. And I'd like to end with a sentence where in this project we embarked upon a journey to study the contribution of American Jewry to Israel's national security. And we realized that it's a much more complex issue than we thought, and that is the national security of the Jewish people, at the core of which is a strong and healthy and mutual connection between all the parts of the Jewish people. And I hope that the discussion today will help understand these relations between Israel and the diaspora Jews as a counterweight in the national security of the State of Israel, and as an integral part of the designation of our country to be the homeland of the Jewish nation as a whole. Thank you very much.